Welcome to City Vision University's podcast, providing book summaries of books on rescue missions, city missions, and the Salvation Army.
Glad to be here.
So, I want you to imagine holding the cure to a deadly disease. You know it works. You have seen it save lives with your own eyes.
Right.
But to get the funding to actually distribute it on a massive scale, the local government and your biggest donors tell you that you have to water down the medicine.
Yeah, they tell you the ingredients are just, too controversial.
Yeah.
Or maybe too outdated.
Exactly. Not palatable to the general public. And if you refuse, they pull your funding and the clinic just closes.
Wow.
But if you agree, you get to stay open, sure, but you're basically handing out sugar pills while people continue to die. And that agonizing paradox is the exact dilemma facing thousands of rescue missions across the country today.
It really is. It's an impossible spot to be in.
It is. And today we're doing a deep dive into a 2013 doctoral project report by James R. Davison from Weinbrenner Theological Seminary. It's titled The Tension of Countercultural Rescue Ministries Seeking Support from the Current Culture.
And it's worth noting right up front that Davison spent nearly 2 decades as a director at a city mission.
Yeah.
So we are not dealing with abstract academic theory here.
Right. This isn't just someone in a library guessing how this works.
Exactly. We are examining the grinding day-to-day reality of operating a gospel rescue mission in a culture that is, it's rapidly changing its baseline views on religion, social services, and morality.
Yeah.
The central question he poses is really one of survival and identity. How does a life-saving organization raise money and build community support without, selling out the deepest convictions that define why it exists in the first place?
So what does this all mean? We are going to explore this not just as an operational manual for homeless shelters, but really as a masterclass in holding on to an organizational identity when the surrounding world is demanding that you change.
Yeah, and Davison starts by giving us a look at the ground-level reality of what he calls the delicate tightrope.
Right, with Robert and Susan.
Exactly, Robert and Susan. They were co-directors who took over a local city mission, and they came in highly motivated, ready to alleviate suffering in their city. But almost immediately, they hit a massive wall of resistance.
And the crazy part is where the resistance came from.
Right. What's fascinating here is that this resistance wasn't just coming from secular critics in the media or the government.
No, it was coming from their own board.
Their own board, their community, and their historic donor base.
Yeah, Robert and Susan found themselves under fire simply for enforcing the original charter of their mission. The charter explicitly mandated preaching the gospel to the individuals utilizing their shelter.
Yeah, they actually had to go digging through their organization's dusty archives. They were pulling out the original founding documents just to prove to their own stakeholders that this place was established on the absolute bedrock of Christian evangelism.
Which really highlights this profound disconnect between how the mission views itself and how the public views the mission.
Completely. Because, rescue missions occupy this very strange space in the modern civic ecosystem.
Yeah, they alleviate highly visible socio-political problems. They feed the hungry, they get people off the sidewalks, they manage addiction recovery.
And because they perform those tangible social goods, the general public and the city council and local businesses, they tend to view them merely as secular social agencies.
Right, they look at the mission the exact same way they look at the fire department or a public hospital, just a civic utility.
But if you talk to the directors, they don't see themselves as a civic utility at all. From their perspective, the primary charter is spiritual rescue.
Yeah, the social work like handing out blankets, the hot meals, the beds, that's merely the context. It's the vehicle through which they minister the gospel.
And that creates a severe financial friction point.
Oh, absolutely.
Because if you think about how a typical church operates, right? A church is a relatively closed loop. The members attend the services, they tithe, and those tithes pay the pastor's salary and keep the lights on.
Right. But a rescue mission does not have a wealthy congregation sitting in its pews. It serves people who have absolutely nothing.
Exactly. Therefore, it relies entirely on public donors. And many of those donors, whether they're secular philanthropists or corporate sponsors or just folks from different faith backgrounds, they only care about the social metrics.
Right. They want to fund the soup. They have zero interest in funding the sermon.
Exactly. And Davison traces the mechanics of how that financial pressure actually alters an organization's DNA. It's a phenomenon known in the nonprofit sector as mission drift.
Mission drift.
Yeah, because funding dictates marketing, and marketing inevitably dictates operations. If an organization wants to secure a broad base of secular donors or, win a massive municipal grant, The overwhelming temptation is to hide the religious aspects of the work.
Right. So the promotional brochures stop mentioning spiritual salvation.
Yeah, they start emphasizing only the sterile social metrics. The mailers say, like, we served 10,000 meals last year, or we provided 5,000 nights of safe shelter.
And the leadership downplays the strict religious rules or the mandatory chapel services because they know those elements might alienate a corporate sponsor who demands a purely secular approach.
Exactly.
Okay, let's unpack this with the thought experiment because I think this really helps clarify the stakes. Imagine a beloved historic bakery in your town.
Okay.
It's been there for generations, famous for a very specific, incredibly unique family recipe. Like maybe it uses a rare type of flour or this super labor-intensive baking process. It is the absolute soul of the business.
Right. It's what makes them who they are.
Exactly. Now, the city approaches the bakery and offers them a $10 million grant to expand their operations to feed thousands of low-income residents across 10 new locations.
That sounds amazing on paper.
Right. But there is just one catch. The city dictates that the bakery must switch to a generic, mass-produced, fortified bread recipe.
Huh.
The city argues that the original recipe is, too specific, it doesn't appeal to everyone, and it doesn't align with the city's standardized dietary guidelines.
Yeah, and if the bakery says no, the public backlash is going to be immediate.
Oh, massive.
The perception is that these stubborn bakers care more about their eccentric recipe than they do about actually feeding starving people. They look arrogant, ungrateful, and uncooperative.
But if they say yes and accept the $10 million, they lose the very essence of why they exist. Like, they cease to be the historic bakery and simply become a generic municipal bread factory.
And that is the exact trap Robert and Susan fell into. If a mission emphasizes its strict rules, it loses the grant. If it drops the rules to secure the grant, it loses its soul.
But that prompts a really fundamental question, like, why are these missions so fiercely committed to these rules in the first place?
It's a fair question.
Because to a casual observer, it just looks like arbitrary gatekeeping, right? Like, Why not just drop the religious requirements and feed everyone?
Yeah, and to understand the depth of this conviction, Davison takes us far beyond modern nonprofit management. He dives into the historical and theological DNA of the rescue movement.
Right, going way back.
You really cannot understand the modern rescue mission without understanding the slums of 1865 East London. Davison traces the movement's modern iteration to William Booth,
who founded the Salvation Army.
Exactly, and Booth walked into an environment of poverty that is honestly hard for us to comprehend today. We are talking about rampant cholera, open sewers, workhouses, and just generational starvation.
Yeah, absolute desperation.
And Booth recognized a crucial reality. He realized you cannot preach the gospel to a man who is literally starving to death. His physical agony is too loud. The body has to be stabilized first.
But Booth equally believed that simply handing a starving man a piece of bread without addressing the profound spiritual void and the behavioral patterns that contributed to his condition was basically a mockery of true salvation.
Right. The famous phrase was soup, soap, and salvation.
Soup, soap, and salvation. I love that.
Yeah, you feed the man, you clean him up. But the ultimate goal, the actual cure, is the salvation of his soul. That's why it was the Salvation Army. They didn't call themselves the Volunteer Army or the Social Relief Army.
Right. Their entire identity was bound up in this dual mandate. Booth taught that spiritual transformation was the ultimate cure for the world's physical and social ills.
Exactly. If you change a man's heart, he stops drinking the family's wages away, he returns to his children, he seeks employment. The social relief was the immediate triage, but the spiritual salvation was the long-term cure.
And Davison pushes the timeline back even further than that, right? Looking at ancient texts to explain where this philosophy of rescue hospitality originated.
Yeah, he examines the ancient Hebrew tradition of haknasat orchim.
The bringing in of strangers.
Exactly. This traces all the way back to the book of Genesis, with Abraham rushing to welcome 3 unknown travelers at his tent, providing them with water to wash their feet and preparing a feast.
Because in the ancient Near East, hospitality was not just a polite gesture. It was literally a matter of life and death in a harsh desert environment, and it evolved into a divine commandment.
And that intense commitment to hospitality transitioned directly into the early Christian church. Davison highlights a text called the D-Doc.
The D-Doc.
Yeah, it's this fascinating manual of Christian teachings and practices dating back to the late 1st or early 2nd century.
Wow, so the very dawn of the church.
Right, a time when Christianity was just this network of underground house churches. And the D-Doc served as a practical handbook for these communities. It contains highly specific instructions on how to handle the constant flow of travelers, specifically wandering prophets or teachers who would arrive claiming to speak for God.
And the instructions are astonishingly pragmatic. The text establishes the strict 3-day rule.
The 3-day rule.
Yeah, it dictates that if a traveling prophet arrives at your community, you are to welcome them with total hospitality. You feed them, you shelter them, you treat them as an honored guest for 1 day or 2 days, or at the absolute maximum, 3 days.
But on that 3rd day.
Right. The text explicitly states that if the traveler attempts to stay beyond that 3rd day and refuses to work or contribute to the community, they are a Christ peddler.
A Christ peddler.
Yeah. They're essentially a grifter exploiting the charity of the church for a free meal.
I mean, the psychological insight of that 1st century document is profound. And Davison draws a direct, unbroken line from the D-Doc to modern rescue missions. He notes that at the Findlay City mission, where he operated, they utilized a nearly identical modern translation of this ancient rule.
Really?
Yeah. When a transient guest arrives at the mission, they're provided with 3 days of free, unconditional shelter and food. They aren't interrogated. They're just given triage. But on the morning of the 4th day, the relationship fundamentally shifts. If the guest wishes to remain, they must demonstrate a willingness to work.
Like chores around the facility.
Exactly. Chores, or actively engaging in the mission's structured rehabilitation programs.
Wait, isn't charity supposed to be unconditional? At what point does unconditional love require setting strict boundaries? Because if I am a homeless individual and it is 20 degrees outside, I don't care about the theological implications of a 1st century manuscript. I just need a bed.
Right.
It feels incredibly privileged for someone sitting in a heated administrative office to decide that cutting a freezing person off after 3 days is an act of compassion. How do they justify turning someone back out onto the street just to teach them a lesson about entitlement?
That is the exact moral collision that mission directors face daily, and it requires us to completely reevaluate the mechanics of compassion. If we connect this to the bigger picture, in the worldview of the rescue mission, setting a strict boundary is not a suspension of compassion. No, they view it as the ultimate expression of it. And to explain the mechanism behind this, Davison references several critical studies on poverty alleviation, specifically When Helping Hurts by Steve Corbett and Brian Fickert, and Toxic Charity by Robert Lupton.
Oh, I've heard of those. They dissect the psychology of paternalism, right?
Exactly. Paternalism, doing for others what they can and should do for themselves.
Because if we continuously provide for someone without requiring any reciprocal effort or behavioral change, we are not rescuing them. We're functionally infantilizing them. We strip away their agency and their dignity.
Yeah. And Lupton's research in Toxic Charity reveals a deeply uncomfortable truth about modern philanthropy. Many well-meaning donors measure the success of their charity by how it makes the donor feel, rather than analyzing the long-term objective outcome for the recipient.
Right. The donor writes a check or hands out a sleeping bag, feels a rush of moral satisfaction, and walks away.
But the mission worker on the ground observes the chemical and psychological reality. If you provide a chronic addict with free room, board, and zero expectations indefinitely, you aren't saving their life. You are comfortably warehousing them while their addiction slowly kills them.
Wow.
The boundaries, the strict rules, the requirement to participate in recovery, that friction is the actual medicine.
Which basically guarantees a perpetual public relations nightmare.
Completely.
Because the broader culture operates on an entirely different definition of compassion. The public views the homeless individual primarily as a victim of circumstance who lacks material housing, but the mission views the homeless individual as a deeply broken person who requires a total systemic life overhaul.
And when those two operating systems collide, the mission almost invariably looks like the villain. Davison quotes a prominent 1973 critique by sociologist Howard Barr.
Right.
Barr conducted extensive studies on Skid Row populations, and he vehemently attacked what he called strings-attached charity.
Strings attached. Yeah, he documented the creation of what was colloquially known as the mission stiff.
Exactly. His critique was that by attaching strict religious and behavioral requirements to basic human necessities like food and shelter, The missions were forcing vulnerable people into a performance.
Just to survive.
Right. In order to survive, the homeless individual learns to put on a facade of religious compliance. They fake a conversion experience, they bow their heads, they sing the hymns, all as a transactional requirement to secure a bowl of soup and a cot.
Barr argued that this dynamic forces the individual to prostitute their own beliefs to the mission, which just creates a deeply cynical and manipulative environment.
Yeah. And that level of cynicism explodes into public outrage when the mission's strict safety protocols clash with an immediate visible crisis.
Davison outlines a scenario in the source that perfectly encapsulates this, actually. Imagine a freezing winter night. A social worker at a local hospital has a homeless individual sitting in the emergency room waiting area. The individual has been medically discharged, but it is lethally cold outside. So the social worker, trying to do the right thing, puts the individual in a taxi and sends them directly to the local rescue mission.
But when the taxi pulls up to the doors, the mission staff refuse entry.
Yes.
Right.
And the hospital worker is absolutely incensed. They immediately go to the local press, they call city council members, they contact local churches, painting the mission staff as callous hypocrites. Like, how dare you call yourselves a Christian ministry and leave a human being to freeze on the sidewalk?
Right. But what the hospital worker and the subsequent news articles fail to mention is why the individual was turned away.
Exactly. The mechanics of running a shelter dictate that you cannot simply operate as an open-door warehouse. Perhaps the facility was at absolute maximum capacity and fire codes prevented adding another body.
Or, even more likely, this specific individual had previously violated a severe safety protocol. Perhaps they had smuggled a weapon into the dormitories the week before, or they had assaulted a staff member, or they were actively dealing narcotics to residents who were in the fragile early stages of detox.
The mission director is performing an agonizing moral calculus. If they break protocol and admit a potentially violent or actively using individual out of a sense of immediate guilt, they are jeopardizing the safety and the sobriety of the 50 vulnerable men currently sleeping inside.
Yeah, but the public, reacting entirely on emotion, only sees the one man left out in the cold. They do not see the 50 men inside whose recovery depends on a secure environment.
And beyond the court of public opinion, these strict protocols invite severe legal jeopardy, particularly when government funding is involved. The source material details a landmark case from 1964 involving the Union Gospel Mission in St. Paul, Minnesota.
Right, the youth camps.
Yeah. The mission had developed an incredible track record for running successful youth camps. The local government recognized this success and approached the mission with a partnership.
The state provided funding for the mission to operate a youth foster program aimed at combating juvenile delinquency. It seemed like a perfect synergy of state resources and nonprofit expertise.
And it functioned beautifully on an operational level, right up until the state government sued the mission.
Yeah, the lawsuit hinged on the mechanics of the First Amendment, specifically the Establishment Clause. The state had placed a Jewish boy into the mission's foster program. But as part of the mission's holistic approach, all youth in the program were required to attend Christian chapel services.
And the state argued successfully that government funds cannot be utilized to mandate religious proselytization. If you take the state's money, you must abide by the state's rules regarding religious neutrality.
The case perfectly illustrates the legal landmines inherent in mixing federal or state grants with countercultural religious mandates.
Here's where it gets really interesting, though. Think about the impossible paradox this creates. The city government and the general public demand that a rescue mission operate like a public emergency room. In a hospital ER, the doors are open to everyone, no questions asked. You triage the immediate physical trauma, stabilize the patient, and discharge them. But a rescue mission is not designed to be an ER.
No, it's architected to operate like a highly intensive long-term rehabilitation clinic. It requires massive personal commitment, it enforces strict behavioral boundaries, and it demands systemic lifestyle changes. You cannot run an intensive rehab clinic using the operational rules of an emergency room.
Exactly. The core disconnect really lies in how we process the concept of homelessness. For the average citizen, the interaction with extreme poverty is brief and entirely emotional.
Right.
You see an individual holding a cardboard sign at a traffic light. You feel a sudden pang of guilt or discomfort. You roll down the window, hand them a $10 bill, and the light turns green.
And as you drive away, your immediate emotional discomfort has been resolved. You feel like you've done a good deed. But the mission worker, standing on that same street corner, understands the grim mechanics of that transaction. Statistically, That $10 bill is not going toward a down payment on an apartment. It is highly likely to fund the chemical addiction that is keeping that individual on the street.
Wow, that $10 might literally be the purchase that results in a fatal overdose.
Yeah. True rescue work, the kind that actually rebuilds a human life, requires a long-term, unsentimental perspective that the general public rarely sees and, frankly, rarely has the stomach to enforce. It is grueling, unglamorous, and often deeply unpopular work.
And rather than just theorizing about this immense pressure, Davison went straight to the front lines. He conducted an extensive survey of mission directors across the Association of Gospel Rescue Missions, or the AGRM, which represents hundreds of facilities across North America.
Right. He wanted to know exactly how these leaders were handling the culture clash.
And the overwhelming consensus from the survey data was a deep sense of defiance. These directors are not apologizing for their methods. They proudly embrace the label of being countercultural.
In an era that many respondents described as a culture of entitlements-like, a society where people expect material provision without any reciprocal requirement of behavioral change, these missions are steadfastly teaching personal responsibility, the reality of sin, and the necessity of hard work.
They are actively leaning into the friction. But that philosophical friction manifests in very physical, logistical battles within their cities. One of the most prominent hurdles identified in the survey is the NMBY phenomenon.
NMBY, not in my backyard.
Yeah. Think about your own neighborhood for a moment. If the city announced tomorrow that a 5-building comprehensive homeless shelter and addiction recovery center was breaking ground right next door to your house or next to your small business, what is your honest, immediate reaction?
Most people would panic. They immediately envision a massive spike in property crime, loitering, plunging property values, and safety issues.
And Davison shares a story from an AGRM listserv detailing exactly this scenario. A mission in Salt Lake City attempted to expand into a 5-building complex, and the local business community immediately mobilized to block the zoning permits.
Yeah, they argued that having hundreds of transient individuals wandering the industrial park created massive liability issues, especially with heavy commercial trucks operating in the area.
It's a completely rational fear from the perspective of the business owners.
It is. But then another director chimed in on the listserv and offered an absolute masterclass in dismantling NIMBYism. James Lewis, the director of the Long Beach Rescue Mission in California, detailed his strategy for neighborhood integration.
Yeah, he didn't wait for the neighborhood to protest. He aggressively courted the community long before he ever submitted a building permit.
His approach to public relations was brilliant because it was rooted in undeniable practical service. Lewis started hosting the local neighborhood association meetings inside the mission facility itself.
Oh, smart.
Yeah, he threw the doors open, provided the coffee, gave tours, and let the neighbors see the cleanliness and the order of the operation, completely dispelling the mystery and the fear.
And he instituted ironclad rules regarding the perimeter of the mission. The rule for residents was simple. You are inside the facility engaging in programming, or you are gone. There was zero tolerance for loitering on the adjacent sidewalks.
If you trace that logic further, Lewis weaponized the mission's resources to actively improve the surrounding blocks. He organized the residents who were in the advanced stages of the case management program and created a dedicated street cleanup crew.
They didn't just sweep in front of the mission, though. They cleaned the entire commercial district.
Exactly. They sponsored a local middle school. They maintained the adjacent public park. Lewis recognized that to exist in a hostile environment, the mission had to become an undeniable, indispensable asset to the community.
He solved the neighborhood's existing problems before they had a chance to complain about his expansion. And the result of that psychological shift was incredible.
When Lewis finally went to the Long Beach City Council to request permits to build a massive new transitional shelter, the very same business owners and neighborhood associations that had fiercely rejected a similar project just 3 years prior actually stood up at the council meeting and publicly supported him.
Wow. That is how you navigate the local political landscape. But the survey also revealed massive divides in how to handle the financial landscape, particularly regarding government funding.
Yeah, Davison highlights the philosophy of Tom Lehman, the director of Mel Trotter Ministries in Grand Rapids, Michigan. Lehman's approach is increasingly radical in the modern nonprofit sector. He institutes a hardline policy of rejecting all government money.
0 federal grants, 0 state aid.
0.
Which means walking away from millions of dollars in potential revenue. Is there a danger that in trying to be so fiercely independent and countercultural, a mission just isolates itself from the community it's trying to serve? How does an organization justify starving itself of that much capital when the need is so massive?
Lehman argues that it is the only viable strategy to survive with the organization's soul intact. He points to the constant looming threat of ACLU lawsuits and First Amendment entanglements.
Right.
If a mission accepts a massive federal grant to expand its housing, those dollars arrive with hundreds of pages of compliance regulations regarding the separation of church and state.
The government might allow the organization to retain its Christian name, and it might allow them to hire staff of their own faith. But the moment federal dollars are involved, the mission absolutely cannot use that money or the facilities funded by that money to educate, proselytize, or mandate religious participation.
And for a director like Lehman, the evangelization is not a side project. It is the primary engine of recovery. If accepting a $2 million grant forces him to cease preaching the gospel in the new wing of the building, the mission has lost its entire reason for existing.
But consider the alternative. Like you mentioned, the risk of isolation. They build a pristine fortress of theological purity, but they lose the financial capacity and the collaborative partnerships necessary to actually engage with the wider secular world they're trying to serve.
That is the perpetual risk. It is the danger of becoming an echo chamber. And Davison utilizes a brilliant framework to explain just how complex it is to balance these forces, drawing heavily from Daisy Brooks' book, The Social Animal.
Oh, I love that book.
Yeah, one of the directors surveyed pointed out that a rescue mission is not a monolith. A single facility actually contains 5 distinct and frequently competing cultures operating simultaneously under one roof.
This concept of 5 cultures colliding inside one building is fascinating. Let's explore the mechanics of how this actually plays out.
Think of it like a surgical operating room, where the lead surgeon, the hospital administrator, the patient's family, and the insurance representative are all standing over the table trying to shout orders at the exact same time. First, you have the professional culture. This represents the board of directors, the executive leadership, and the legal counsel. Their primary concerns are balancing the budget, mitigating legal liability, managing public relations, and executing long-term strategic plans.
That's culture 1, the suits.
Second, you have the evangelical culture. This encompasses many of the frontline staff, the volunteers, and the core conservative donor base. Their lens is entirely theological. Their primary focus is the spiritual salvation of the residents and the uncompromising preaching of the gospel.
Okay, 2.
Third, you have the social work culture. These are the licensed clinical social workers, the psychologists, and the case managers. They operate on the principles of the social sciences. They are tracking psychological metrics, housing placement data, harm reduction strategies, and evidence-based addiction therapies.
So already you have the board worried about the budget, the evangelist worried about the soul, and the social worker tracking cognitive behavioral therapy metrics.
Exactly. And then you introduce the fourth culture, the street or prison culture. This is the operating system brought into the facility by the residents themselves. It is a culture built entirely on survival.
Right.
It is characterized by street smarts, deep-seated trauma, manipulation tactics learned in the prison system, and a profound ingrained distrust of any institutional authority.
And finally, the 5th culture is the mission culture itself. This is the unique, highly idiosyncratic blend of strict behavioral rules, institutional traditions, and intense discipleship programs that the specific organization has developed organically over 50 or 100 years of operation.
Yes.
Let's create a hypothetical scenario to see how these 5 cultures clash. Let's say you have a resident named John. John comes in off the street. The street culture in him immediately tries to figure out how to work the system to get a better bed without having to do chores. The evangelical staff member insists that John needs to be in the front row of the chapel service tonight to hear a specific sermon on repentance. The social worker steps in and argues that John is suffering from severe PTSD, and forcing him into a crowded, loud chapel service is going to trigger a psychological episode. He needs quiet, individual counseling instead.
Meanwhile, the professional board of directors is looking at John as a statistic, noting that if they don't get him placed into permanent housing within 90 days, they miss the metric required to renew a $100,000 city grant.
That scenario plays out dozens of times a day in these facilities. Synthesizing these 5 competing cultures without allowing the organization to tear itself apart requires masterful leadership.
If the evangelical culture completely dominates the executive decisions, the mission risks alienating the professional clinical staff and losing credibility with secular partners. If the professional and social work cultures completely dominate, the facility slowly transforms into a sterile, secular state agency, alienating the core donor base and losing its spiritual identity.
The truly successful directors are the ones who become essentially multilingual. They learn to speak the language of all five cultures and constantly negotiate truces between them to keep the mission moving forward.
And the ultimate battleground, the specific location where the social worker, the street culture, and the evangelical culture inevitably collide every single evening, is the daily chapel service.
Yeah. Historically, the entire operational model of the rescue mission was built on the sequence of Bible, bed and breakfast, or, if you prefer the alliteration, sermon, soup, and shower.
It's the absolute cornerstone of the traditional model, and the survey data that Davison collected demonstrates that a significant portion of directors refused to yield an inch on this specific requirement.
Yeah, one director responded to the survey with incredible passion, writing, "Hurting people need to find their answers to life in Christ alone."
To leaders operating with this conviction, the temporal ministry, the distribution of food, the provision of a warm bed is entirely secondary. The physical relief is merely the platform constructed to deliver the eternal ministry, which is the gospel message.
They back this philosophy up with powerful, lived experiences. The source material details an anecdote about a former resident named Steve.
Right.
Steve's story is the archetypal rescue mission narrative. He was deeply entrenched in chronic homelessness and severe addiction. When he first arrived at the facility, operating entirely out of that street culture mentality, he openly admitted that he absolutely despised the religious aspect. He hated what he called the God stuff.
He didn't want a sermon.
No, he wanted a warm bed and a hot meal to survive the night, and he deeply resented the mandatory chapel requirement.
But the mechanics of his transformation are what validate the mission's approach. Steve eventually progressed through the rehabilitation program, achieved long-term sobriety, and completely rebuilt his life.
And years later, someone asked him to identify the specific catalyst that finally broke his cycle of addiction and got him off the streets.
And Steve's reply was, that God stuff.
That God stuff.
He articulated a profound realization. When he was living on the streets, he only knew what he wanted, comfort and survival. He lacked the capacity to know what he actually needed.
That story is the ultimate trump card for the evangelical culture within the mission. It proves to them that even if a resident is highly resistant, even if they are angry and purely transactional in the beginning, the forced exposure to the message is the vital, necessary catalyst for true internal transformation.
However, Davison's research also points out that the landscape is evolving. Not every single mission operates with that hardline, mandatory approach anymore.
Right. There is a growing recognition within the movement that the blunt force, mandatory approach can sometimes backfire, particularly when dealing with populations suffering from severe psychological trauma.
As the social work culture gains more influence within these organizations, many missions are experimenting with new mechanics. Some have transitioned entirely to voluntary chapel services, focusing on building relational trust rather than enforcing mandatory attendance.
Others utilize complex incentive-based systems. A resident might not be required to attend chapel to receive a basic mat on the floor, but if they choose to attend and engage in the spiritual programming, they earn access to a better dormitory, enhanced privileges, or preferred vocational training assignments.
They are attempting to engineer a balance between offering the spiritual medicine and respecting the psychological agency of the individual.
Yet, even with those softer variations, it requires a staggering level of conviction to sit across a mahogany table from a wealthy corporate donor or a municipal grant committee, look them in the eye and say, "No, we will not remove the religious programming, even if it costs us your $1 million check."
Yeah.
In the pragmatic, revenue-driven corporate world, that level of ideological stubbornness is almost unfathomable.
This raises an important question, though. It highlights the fundamental, unbridgeable philosophical divide between the secular civic structure and the countercultural rescue mission. If you analyze how the secular world approaches the concept of homelessness, it views it primarily as a material deficit. A person lacks a physical structure called a house, therefore they are categorized as homeless. Following that logic, the cure is entirely material. Provide the individual with a subsidized apartment and vocational training.
And from that purely material perspective, forcing a resident to sit through a religious service is an archaic, irritating, and unnecessary string attached to the delivery of basic human rights.
But the mission director looks at that exact same individual and diagnoses an entirely different disease.
Completely different. To the traditional rescue worker, the lack of material housing is not the disease. It is merely the most visible symptom of a profound internal, spiritual, or relational collapse.
They argue that an individual does not end up chronically living on a sidewalk simply because they lost a job. They end up on the sidewalk because of a catastrophic breakdown in family relationships, an unmanageable chemical dependency, or deep unaddressed trauma.
Therefore, handing them the keys to an apartment does not cure the disease. It merely moves the brokenness indoors.
Right. To the mission, the actual cure is spiritual transformation, a total rewiring of the individual's heart, identity, and behavioral patterns. The housing, the sobriety, and the employment are not the cure. They are the natural, inevitable byproducts of that internal spiritual resurrection.
Consequently, when the city asks the mission to remove the chapel service to receive funding, the mission hears the city asking them to remove the actual medicine and just hand out bandages.
That distinction between the material cure and the spiritual cure has fueled debates for over a century. But Davison's research transitions into a final, critical area, demonstrating that modern missions are now facing entirely new cultural fault lines.
Right. We are talking about massive societal shifts that William Booth could never have comprehended in 1865. And as we discuss this, we're going to look impartially at the findings of the source material. We are examining the logistical and legal realities these organizations face as the ground shifts beneath their feet.
The source material details the immense compounding pressure rescue missions are currently navigating regarding the rapidly evolving legal landscape surrounding sexuality, same-sex marriage, and gender identity.
Yeah.
The vast majority of these historic rescue missions operate on traditional conservative biblical interpretations of marriage and biological sex. For decades, this theological stance was largely a private internal matter that did not generate significant public conflict.
But as the surrounding culture and, more importantly, local municipal non-discrimination ordinances have rapidly secularized and shifted, these countercultural ministries find themselves caught in a blinding spotlight of legal and public scrutiny.
Davison provides a highly specific logistical example from the AGRM communications network that illustrates just how complex this becomes on the ground. A director named Kitty Killian, who operated a women's shelter facility, reached out to the network for urgent advice on a highly sensitive issue.
She was asking for guidance on how to safely, respectfully, and legally house individuals who identify as transgender.
And to understand the gravity of this, you have to understand the physical architecture of a traditional rescue mission. These are not private hotel rooms. These facilities are fundamentally built on strict, biologically sex-segregated environments. You have massive open-bay dormitories housing 50 or 100 men in bunk beds. And you have entirely separate, highly secure facilities for women.
And the necessity for that segregation is deeply rooted in the trauma histories of the populations they serve. A significant percentage of the women seeking emergency shelter are fleeing active domestic violence, sexual assault, or human trafficking.
The women's dormitories are designed to be absolute safe havens. So when an individual who identifies as transgender requests emergency shelter, the mission director is suddenly thrust into a staggering logistical and legal labyrinth. They have to simultaneously navigate the psychological comfort and safety of the traumatized female residents, the physical safety of the transgender individual, the organization's own deeply held theological convictions regarding gender, and a complex web of local, municipal, non-discrimination laws that dictate how public accommodations must be provided.
The warning that emanated from the veteran directors in the survey was stark and urgent. The cultural and legal tectonic plates are shifting rapidly. If a mission board decides to just wing it, or if they wait until a crisis is standing in their lobby at 2 a.m. to figure out their policy, they are walking into an organizational catastrophe.
Yeah, the survey respondents hammered home the point that missions must proactively draft painstakingly clear, legally vetted, and well-prayed-through policies regarding these issues before the crisis occurs.
A failure to clearly articulate their operational boundaries will inevitably lead to devastating lawsuits, catastrophic public relations damage, and the potential forced closure of the facility.
One veteran respondent offered an ultimate, sobering warning about the temptation to compromise theology for the sake of survival. They warned that an organization cannot chase the approval of wealthy secular donors or the security of massive government grants at the expense of its core vision.
Right, because the moment a board of directors allows the fear of a negative news cycle or the desire for a multi-million-dollar expansion to dictate their operational theology, the mission is already dead.
The buildings might remain open, the beds might be full, but the countercultural rescue ministry has ceased to exist.
So if you're a mission director today, you aren't just managing beds and soup kitchens. You essentially have to be a constitutional lawyer navigating the First Amendment.
It is an incredibly demanding, multidisciplinary role. But Davison synthesizes this entire challenge beautifully in his conclusion. He observes that while the core message of a gospel rescue mission, the spiritual rescue, the theological foundation, might be viewed as timeless and unchanging, their methods of delivery, their administrative competence, and their public relations strategies must constantly adapt to the modern world.
Yeah.
If a mission alienates its surrounding community simply because of a lack of clear communication, arrogant leadership, or because they haven't done the hard work of thinking through their policies on complex modern issues, they do not get to claim they are being persecuted martyrs for the faith.
Right. They're simply experiencing the natural consequences of bad management.
Exactly. An organization can absolutely remain fiercely countercultural in its theology, but it still has an absolute obligation to be competent, professional, and transparent about exactly who they are and why they operate the way they do.
That is the delicate tightrope walk in its entirety. It is a grueling, everyday battle to provide immediate, life-saving physical triage while remaining immovably anchored to a spiritual philosophy that much of the surrounding culture simply does not understand, does not agree with, and often actively opposes.
It is the historic bakery, fighting with everything it has to keep its secret recipe alive while the city council stands outside demanding generic, mass-produced bread.
And every single morning, the leadership of these thousands of missions wake up and have to decide if that agonizing tension is worth the fight.
Based on the deep, resilient defiance documented in Davison's study, for the men and women operating on the front lines, the answer remains a resounding yes.
As we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave you with a final thought to chew on. Think about the implications of this tension, not just for homeless shelters, but for any organization built on deep convictions.
Okay.
If an organization achieves incredible, documented success in rehabilitating shattered lives, like getting people off crippling narcotics, off the freezing sidewalks, and successfully reintegrating them back into society, but that success is rooted entirely in a strict countercultural worldview that the broader society finds offensive or outdated, who eventually has to blink? Does the culture eventually learn to tolerate or even quietly appreciate these rigid religious methods because they simply cannot argue with the life-saving results? Or does the relentless financial and legal pressure of the modern world ensure that the charity slowly, inevitably dilutes its methods, abandoning its soul just to keep the lights on?
That's a powerful question to end on.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Keep wrestling with the hard questions.